Well, good evening. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the fifth session. And we move to the theme this evening of Ireland and the British Empire, the one of the European empires with which on this island we have been most involved. And we're looking tonight at some of that story or history of Ireland and the British Empire. Now, when tracing the relationship between the island of Ireland and the neighbouring island, the origins of that relationship are perceived very differently. It might be seen in one way from here and perceived in another way from across there. But clearly there was a relationship that was going back a very long way. When raiding parties, for example, crossed the Irish Sea in both directions, making a lot of wealth out of slaves. It was a big part of the economy. And a Romano-British 16-year-old called Patrick made the journey twice. First as a slave, and then a voluntary return as a Christian on mission. Perhaps he came back as a bishop. A few centuries later, the Vikings arrived, they stayed, they formed the main towns and cities that we now know in Ireland, and they had their bishops. When they accepted Christianity, they had their own bishops connected to Canterbury and through Canterbury to Rome. Now, none of this has been seen as colonial, though what the Vikings did to the church eventually led to the end of the early Irish church and the establishment of a diocesan and centralized structure that was thoroughly Romanized. Now, this really happened when the Normans or the Plantagenets arrived in 1171, and a world in which the political and religious were one brought Ireland into the Plantagenet Empire and the church increasingly into the centralized Roman system. Now, crucial to this moment in Irish history was a marriage. It was a marriage in 1171 in Waterford between Aoife, daughter of Diarmaid McMaster, a deposed Irish king, and Richard, Earl of Pembroke, a leading Norman or Plantagenet brought to Ireland by Diarmaid in an attempt by Diarmaid to reclaim his crown. It was all a rather complex power issue, and the marriage sealed an intricate Irish-Norman relationship. In 2021, last year, Aoife and Richard celebrated their 850th wedding anniversary, and the rest is overly complex history. Now, the Pope had granted Ireland to the Plantagenet King Henry II in 1155. Henry did nothing at the time, but when he decided to cash the papal check in 1172, he put into Waterford and received the pledged loyalty of Irish chiefs and bishops at Cashel. Ireland became a lordship connected to the Norman crown, though still something of a separate jurisdiction. And this remained until 1541. There was an Irish Parliament with limited powers, and any legislation passed in the Irish Parliament had to be approved by the English Council. Indeed, the Irish Parliament could only be called when the Council in England approved. All this began to change in 1541, when by an act King Henry VIII declared himself not only King of England, but also King of Ireland. And Henry also brought his Anglican form of Protestantism to Ireland, and eventually it became the state church, established in law and effectively an arm of government in Ireland, and party to penal laws which restricted Catholics in relation to property and land and education and religious rights, as well as voting rights and political representation. Now, constitutionally, if you like, this was where Ireland was in relation to the Crown until the Act of Union was passed in 1800. The Church of Ireland itself remained established until William Gladstone's Act of disestablishment in 1869. The Act of Union in 1800 abolished the Irish Parliament in College Green and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Union had been considered before in 1707 when Scotland and England were united by an Act of Parliament. 2 years later, the Irish House of Lords wanted the same for Ireland, but England refused. When England offered union in 1750, the Irish refused. Now, the Irish Rising of 1798 shook the English, especially the involvement of the French. And the best way they felt to deal with this Irish problem was believed to be through the Act of Union. Now, the Catholic middle class in Ireland and the Catholic hierarchy, led by Archbishop Troy of Dublin, were willing to go along with the Union, provided there was Catholic emancipation. However, the English government would not allow the Irish Parliament to legislate for that emancipation. The Union, above anything else, had to be secured. Now, all of this history is rather complex in the way in which it unfolds. And that's evident right from the relationship with the Plantagenet or Anglo-Norman kingdom. It could be said, if we go back to there for a moment, that England at this point, England is part of the Plantagenet Empire, a French empire, which by the time of Henry VIII has become an independent English kingdom, which at this point colonizes Ireland. Now, it depends on how English history is read or interpreted, and on how we tell or need to tell an Irish story. However history is interpreted, there is little doubt that from the arrival of the Tudors in Ireland, Ireland has been dominated politically and economically by the neighbouring island. There is a relationship, not of equals, but of dominating, dominated, superior, inferior, ruler, ruled, and many would say colonizer and colonized. It has certainly been an unequal relationship, not just politically and economically, but in terms of military power and presence. Now, if we come forward to the plantation of Ulster, which followed the 9 Years' War involving Hugh O'Neill and Elizabeth I. And on the flight of the Earls in 1607, King James I introduced the Articles of Plantation to bring the unruly northeastern part of Ireland under control and impose the true faith of Protestantism. That's what the Articles said. And the plantation brought many Scots Presbyterians to Ulster and introduced a controlling population of settlers among the native population of Gaels, though both were in fact Gaels, both speaking the same Gaelic language. Jonathan Barden has written more extensively on this as colonization and points out a fairly obvious thing, that England had attempted plantations before, but this time it was much more legally and carefully drawn up. In 1608, Ulster was mapped as an essential to plantation, and the plantation strategists justified the colonization scheme on political and moral grounds. They in fact closely studied models from the history of the Roman colonies in Europe and Africa and Asia. And the most widely read book in England at that time was a 1583 English translation of a Spanish book, The Spanish Colony. And then an unknown author had published an influential book on the planting of colonies in 1968, which spoke of the 6 entire counties escheated to the Crown in Ulster. Now, in the classic language of the colonizers, and the colonization was justified because Ulster was believed to be so deep, they said, so depopulated, and the Irish, they said, were portrayed as fickle and disloyal and rude and unskilled in farming and unfit tenants. And then the author of this document actually turned to the Bible to further justify colonization. Appeal was made to the conquest and settlement of the land of Canaan by the children of Israel. This even included the command of God to root out all the natives. Joshua first surveyed the land and then fairly distributed it in manageable lots, and it was all overseen by the wisdom of God. And so covenant and chosenness, promised land, did become the central motif of the Presbyterian settlers in Ulster. It does seem that the plantation of Ulster was seen as an act of colonization by the dominant power, and as the articles were declared, settlers or colonizers had already left England for Virginia on the other side of the Atlantic, and there was very little to distinguish the Honourable the Irish Society from the Virginia Company. And the towns that were built and created in Virginia and Georgia were modelled on the Ulster plantation towns of Coleraine, Belturbet, Enniskillen, and the city of now Londonderry. From 1300 to 1900, Ireland experienced some 30 severe famines, the worst of which was the Great Famine of 1845 to 1849. This was the last famine and the most remembered. The potato was a stable diet, and for 3 seasons out of 4, the crop failed. 3 million people subsisted on the potato, and Ireland's population was severely reduced through departures for North America, at least 1 million deaths, and the eviction of 90,000 people by 1849 due to ruthless landlords, often absentee. The population declined by 1/5, and it never recovered. Now, the Great Famine narrative is highly contested and controversial. The role of religious communities is pretty mixed at this time, from superism to sacrificial efforts by clergy and outstanding relief work by the small religious community of Quakers. The role of the British government is the most controversial, with some relief provided, but an economic system that seemed powerless to change direction. Public works were introduced, and Indian meal was brought in from America and distributed. But a deterministic economic ideology placed government in a straitjacket. Leading government officials were evangelical Anglicans and strong believers in providentialism. God had ordained history and the economic system. The famine, they even said, was God's way of reducing an already too large Irish population, even a punishment. Economic practice was laissez-faire, the archpriest of which was Adam Smith. The free market was necessary for competition, and individuals could better their own condition. But all of this was ordained of God, said the evangelical Anglicans, and the British politician in charge of relief in Ireland, Charles Trevelyan, had Adam Smith's ideology printed as guidebooks for those working on the ground and responsible for feeding the hungry. The laws of God could not be broken without divine displeasure. Now, the issue is still disputed as to whether the UK government could have done more, even with a prevailing providentialism, to alleviate distress in part of the world's richest nation. After 1849 and the Great Famine, there was a huge demand for land reform. That demand for land reform increased, and some reform was set in motion. not fully realized until 1906. But before that, the demand for land reform began to morph into a demand for home rule for Ireland. It began as a home rule parliament for Ireland, still within the British Empire. In this era, towards the end of the 19th century, nationalism and unionism were formed, both, in fact, also developing minorities, albeit, but developing physical force traditions. And then came 1914 and 1918 and World War I, and 200,000 Irish fought and died together with the British Army in the trenches of France and Belgium and in Gallipoli. We had the 1916 Rising, the 1918 general election, pivotal events in a push for independence from Britain and from the Empire. Home rule is now moving into a demand for independence. Was Ireland's first colony going to break away and gain independence? And if that happened, the big fear at the heart of the metropolis and at the heart of the empire, if that happened in Ireland, would India, the jewel in the crown, be next? And after World War I, the British Empire was badly shaken and shaking. 1920 saw the Government of Ireland Act partition Ireland. And by this stage, most Irish people wanted to leave the empire. A minority of Irish in the northeast wanted to remain in the empire. But Ireland was partitioned, and the province of Ulster was partitioned also. In 1921, Edward Carson complained bitterly in the House of Lords that he and the Unionists were duped and made fools of by the Conservative Party, who were only interested, he said, in being in power. The next day, Lord Birkenhead, who was one of the negotiators of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on the British side, made a speech in response and in turn utterly flayed Carson, with the result that in many ways that was the end of Carson's political career. But we've moved on a century. There is no empire now. There is quite a bit of imperial nostalgia. We've had Brexit. We've had the future of the UK. We have the future of the UK in question. We've had a global pandemic. We have a new world order, it would seem, emerging. And maybe above all else, we have the future of a planet at crisis point and uncertain. So where has Ireland sat in all of this in relation to this empire? And how has the empire been related to Ireland in all of this? I think we take the chance now to go into rooms. Loretta will allocate those. And we have a couple of questions we might want to look at. Ireland was England's first colony. Is this recognizable? Is it recognizable as a colony in the events of plantation and the Great Famine? And then a question that is a very contemporary question, and one that I think we need to ask. How would you describe the relationship between the two islands now? So we'll take 20 minutes to look at that, or those questions, or maybe other questions, and then we'll come back and we'll hear what the conversations have produced. Loretto. Well, welcome back to part two. And we take a look at some Irish in the service of the Empire. I suppose Ireland's relationship to the British Empire was ambiguous, to say the least. There were always those who resisted, and various risings took place. And Ireland was part, after all, of the largest of the European empires, and Irish people benefited from that particular engagement and involvement. Many left Ireland for other parts of the empire, and many made new lives there. And Irishmen made up a very large part of the British Army long before 200,000 went off to fight in World War I. And so there were those who served the empire in diplomatic posts and in the administrative systems that kept the empire oiled and running. And there were medics and there were teachers from Ireland working across the global empire. Ireland was an integral part of the empire, and Irish people helped to build the empire and keep it going. And the religious binaries didn't seem to matter. There were Catholic and there were Protestant Irish in the service of the empire. And at the same time, there were Catholic and Protestant Irish resisting. I suppose it's a bit too simplistic to categorize people as true Irish, lesser Irish, or traitors to a national cause. There are perhaps very few families in Ireland without ambiguous histories, with stories of those who resisted and of those who served the empire in various ways. Life and lives are much too complex, and I'm sure we need to recognize our ambiguities and indeed our complex family histories. My maternal grandfather fought in the Battle of Jutland, I suppose for king and empire, in 1916. That's a fact. I don't think he was a unionist. He was much too committed to labour politics, perhaps, to be a unionist. And unlike my paternal grandfather, in the Ards Peninsula, he did not sign the Ulster Covenant in resistance to Home Rule for Ireland. So keeping all of this sort of complexity in mind, let's look at some pen portraits of some of the Irish people in the service of empire. And the first is Viscount Castlereagh, as he was known, or otherwise known, he became later known as Viscount Castlereagh, but he was known also as the Marquess of Londonderry. He was born in 1769 as Robert Stewart. He was born in Dublin. The big home was the big house, and that is Mount Stewart House, which you can still visit on the Ards Peninsula in County Down. Now, he was a Presbyterian, but he was not in that radical Presbyterian category of the United Irishmen. His clergy person was Robert Porter of Grey Abbey, was a frequent visitor to Mount Stewart. Porter wrote some satirical literature at the time, and it was thought that the key character in this, who was being lampooned in some kind of way, was in fact Stewart or Londonderry himself. Now, he took vengeance, okay, because much to his wife's displeasure and every effort being made by her, did not stop Robert Stewart from having Porter, the Presbyterian minister, hanged outside his Presbyterian meeting house in Grey Abbey. So he was Presbyterian, but not that radical Presbyterian camp that was associated very much with the United Irishmen. But he moved through a career, and in 1812, from 1812 to 1822, Castlereagh, as it had become known at this stage, was the British Foreign Secretary. And he was a key player in the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The Congress of Vienna met in 1815, having followed the collapse of Napoleon and the Napoleonic advancement and conquest. Napoleon had collapsed. 1815 was Europe meeting together and trying to restore some kind of order and create some kind of peace. And the key architect of all that, alongside the famous Austrian Chancellor Metternich, was in fact Castlereagh. Castlereagh was very much an architect of the European settlement. It was a conservative peace and a conservative settlement that largely restored the status quo in Europe. It lasted, even survived the interruption of the 1848 revolutions across Europe, but that conservative settlement or peace lasted until 1914 and the outbreak of World War I. So Castlereagh was possibly Britain's greatest foreign secretary, maybe ever. And in a strange, ironic way, and ironic now, Castlereagh was even Britain's greatest European. In a few years after his time as well, during his time as British Foreign Secretary, he developed paranoia, symptoms of paranoia. He had a nervous breakdown. It can be described, I think, in that way. One of the big things he was struggling with, he feared prosecution. He feared that he was going to be prosecuted for homosexuality. Now, we've no way of knowing that was true or not, but it was a fear that Castlereagh had. And he feared that the same thing was going to happen to him that was happening to the Church of Ireland Bishop of Clogher, Percy Johnston, who was on trial for acts of homosexuality. And that, of course, was illegal and criminal according to law at that time. And Castlereagh feared that that's where he was heading. And so at 7:30 a.m. on the 12th of August, 1822, Castlereagh was found dead in his dressing room, having cut his own throat. It was a tragic end for an Irish giant in British imperial and European politics. A second Irish person in the service of empire was George Earl Macartney. Macartney was born in 1737 from a plantation family. His family had come across from Scotland in the plantation with the articles of plantation. They had come to the north of Antrim, to a townland of Lissanure, which is very close to Lough Giel in County Antrim. George Macartney was born there. His higher education was in Trinity College, Dublin, and he became, from a very early stage, a top-ranking British statesperson, a colonial administrator, and a diplomat. Macartney made an enormous contribution to the British Empire. After negotiating a British-Russian alliance with no less than Catherine the Great of Russia, and going on then to serve as Chief Secretary of Ireland, King George III, the monarch of the time, thought, this is a man that we need to send on a mission, as head of a mission, to open up trade with the Chinese government in Beijing. Now, it was at a diplomatic meeting before this in Paris that Macartney from Lough Giel, a guy from County Antrim, coined the expression, a vast empire on which the sun never sets. George Macartney was the first to use that expression. So he set off on this mission to China with his delegation. He arrived in China as a representative, the representative of the power of the British Empire, laden with all sorts of gifts for the Chinese emperor, including an enormous big telescope, which they had to somehow or other transport from a ship and across country, because the problem was the emperor wasn't where they thought the emperor was when they arrived. He was off hunting somewhere, as emperors maybe do. Well, they finally got to some destination with all this great load of baggage of gifts and the emperor, and they were received by the emperor. It didn't get off to the best start because Macartney refused to kowtow, as it was known, to the emperor. That is, you touched your forehead 5 times on the surface of the floor. He refused to do that. He simply genuflected in the way that he would if he was meeting with King George III. Well, that didn't go down terribly well. The Chinese emperor later wrote a letter to King George III telling him that, and this was the language he used, that the king's barbarian merchants had a long journey to China for nothing, and that the British needed to remember the special mandate, as he called it. Now, the special mandate was a reference to the Chinese mandate of heaven that was produced in the thinking of Confucius. And that was a kind of an ultimate claim that was made, a kind of transcendent legitimacy. It was really what the British meant when they talked about, for God, an empire. The Chinese talked about the mandate of heaven. Now, Macartney returned home. His mission was not a success, but he brought back with him a huge amount of information on China. And that information later was of enormous use to the British Empire and its later imperial control of China. So George Earl Macartney of Lissanur, when he was made an earl, that was the title he took. His birthplace, Lissanur, near Lochgeel in County Antrim, was the British Empire's man in China. A third is Sir Henry Pottinger. Now, Pottinger was born into the large family estate that was known, the big house, that was known as Mount Pottinger, that was in Ballymacarrat in East Belfast. And Henry Pottinger was educated at Belfast Royal Academy. In 1813, he's still a very young person, teenager even, he joined the East India Company. And after experience there in 1841, he left for China. He, like Macartney, is sent as the British representative and leader to China, with chief responsibility at this point for establishing British trade. Well, Pottinger fought a war. He fought a war of gunboat diplomacy, blasting the Chinese out of the water, quite literally, with his superior firepower and gunboats, blasting the Chinese into submission. And all because, and so that Britain could expand its trade in opium. Opium, the British had got the Bengalis to produce in large quantities and had been trading it to China for some time. It was time to expand that trade in opium, even though that trade in the opium drug was destroying thousands and millions of Chinese lives. And so Pottinger, having blasted the Chinese out of the Yangtze River negotiated the Treaty of Nanking on the 29th of August 1842. And that treaty opened up, it was already Canton, but that treaty opened up another 5 ports in China for opium trade. And the Chinese had to cede also Hong Kong to the British as a permanent colony. A Chinese appointed leader by the emperor had already taken some steps to eliminate this opium drug and had destroyed vast quantities of it. So Pottinger had won the war, if you like, and he secured an indemnity for the British of no less $21 million, which the Chinese had to pay back. Pottinger became the first governor of Hong Kong from 1841 to 1843, and later he became a member of the British Privy Council. There is a plaque to Pottinger in St. George's Parish Church in Belfast. And there is a rather innocent piece about Pottinger on the website of his old school. A rather whitewashed version of Pottinger, but I suppose you can't tell 1,500 kids that one of their old former pupils was perhaps the greatest international drug dealer on the planet. Last week, we met another character, General Reginald Dyer. Now, he was born to Irish parents, already in the service of the Empire in India. His mother brought him back to Ireland to be educated at Middleton College in Cork. He did some studies and training in medicine in Dublin for a short time, but then he joined the military. And he spent 3 decades with the Bengal Army. Now, Dyer was a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist, if we can use that term. He was totally convinced that the British were in India by the will of God. That's how he saw it and said it. And so on the 13th of April 1919, he ordered a small group of soldiers, which he had brought to a great big enclosed area in Amritsar, where there was a Sikh religious festival going on. And he ordered his soldiers to open fire and keep firing until you've used up your ammunition. Well, that became one of the worst massacres in the history of the British Empire, and it galvanized Indian nationalists. If the mutiny of what the British called a mutiny in 1857 in India had set Indians in the direction of independence, then after Amritsar, there was no turning back at all. The die was now cast for Indian independence. And Dyer became known as the Butcher of Amritsar. It was such an event, horrendous event, that the British retired Dyer in disgrace. But then an interesting thing happened. He returned home, he had to leave India. He came back to England, and he was then supported, backed, if you like, by 2 fellow Irishmen who set about trying to rehabilitate Dyer. And those 2 fellow Irishmen were Sir Edward Carson and Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. And they fought Dyer's corner and tried to rehabilitate Dyer, but the censure of Dyer, after many debates, was still upheld in the House of Commons. And then the Morning Post, which was an influential newspaper at the time, began a whole fundraising campaign on behalf of Dyer. Carson subscribed very generously to that. Not long after all of this, of course, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson was gunned down on the steps of a house in London by the IRA. But the fundraising was hugely successful. Carson subscribing generously, and Rudyard Kipling describing Dyer as the man who saved India. I suppose because of much of this, Dyer suffered a great deal of ill health. He had 2 or 3 strokes. The third stroke claimed his life on the 23rd of July, 1927. Dyer received a full military funeral, coffin draped in the Union flag that had flown over his headquarters in India. His funeral was escorted by the Irish Guards. It passed and it paused at the cenotaph, at which Kipling led a wreath, which said, he did his duty as he saw it. Closely connected to this was Sir Francis Michael O'Dwyer. Sir Francis Michael O'Dwyer was born in 1864 at Barronstown, County Tipperary. He had 2 brothers who also served the Empire in India, and he had 2 other brothers who became Jesuit priests. And O'Dwyer was a career person, climbing the ladder, became eventually the Lieutenant Governor General of the Punjab, where Amritsar was. And O'Dwyer was the Empire's key person when the Amritsar massacre happened. It was O'Dwyer who imposed colonial rule and said that only a despotic kind of paternalism would do. Neither O'Dwyer nor Dyer thought very much of the Indians, even educated Indians. They didn't think they were fit for very much. And so a despotic kind of paternalism was a way in which you kept Indians under control as far as the Governor General of the Punjab was concerned. O'Dwyer's stance was condemned by the British Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu. And O'Dwyer responded to Montagu's condemnation by saying, that's what you get for having a Jew in Whitehall. Well, not a little prejudice, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism there. O'Dwyer retired from India to the West Country of England. And at an East India Association meeting with which he was still involved, at an East India Association meeting in London on the 13th of March 1940 in Westminster in London, O'Dwyer was shot dead in the hall by Udaran Singh in retaliation for the Amritsar massacre. Singh had followed O'Dwyer across the continents to England, found him and shot him dead. And the date of Singh's death is still a national holiday in the Punjab. Now these are only, what, 5 people, 5 Irish people in the service of the Empire. There were a lot more, and there were also those who resisted that empire. We met Sir Roger Casement a couple of weeks ago, who served the empire for 30 years. Then he resisted. In the end, he was hanged for treason. The UVF gunrunner, Fred Crawford, was never ever questioned for gun running, and Sir Edward Carson, who supported General Dyer and called in Newry for a provisional Ulster government, which Churchill described as treasonous, never ever faced any charges, but was given a seat in the House of Lords. Do empires know how to be just? Do empires ever rule justly? Well, we can have a conversation around some of that. Again, maybe a couple of questions might. Do we need to be more honest about Ireland's ambiguous relationship with the empire? There is a narrative, but do we need to be a lot more honest about it? And that last question: do empires, any empire we can think of, we've looked at a number of them, do empires ever rule justly?